Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Usually, when we look at a historical map, there is this expectation of precision. You see a line drawn in ink, a kingdom's border, and you just point and say, that is Rome, or that is Persia. Inside the line or outside the line, it feels definitive.
It provides a sense of order, yeah.
Yeah.
We prefer history to be visible, neatly categorized into distinct nation-states with clear beginnings, clear ends, and solid borders that we can easily digest.
Right. But then you step into the world of the ancient Caucasus, and suddenly that map maker's pen runs out of ink. We are looking at a historical and geographic landscape that is incredibly murky. It is a place where those neat, definitive lines completely break down, and you're left trying to read the smudges on the page.
Because the Caucasus region historically functioned as a profound intersection of empires, languages, and cultures. Attempting to draw a single static line around any polity there, especially in antiquity, is an exercise in frustration.
You really have to abandon the modern concept of the neatly defined nation-state.
Exactly. It just doesn't apply here.
So today, our deep dive takes us right into the center of those murky waters. As part of our Caucasian history series, we're exploring a state known as Caucasian Albania. This was a formidable kingdom that existed from the 4th century BCE all the way to the 9th century in the Eastern Caucasus.
And geographically, we are talking about a territory that spans present-day Azerbaijan and southern Dagestan.
Yeah, and for you listening, think of this deep dive as an exercise in high-stakes historical detective work. We are piecing together a lost civilization from washed-away manuscripts, from rock inscriptions left by Roman centurions on the shores of the Caspian Sea, and from the language of a tiny surviving community today.
It is a compelling reconstruction effort. We are examining a buffer state caught in a perpetual geopolitical tug-of-war between the Roman, Parthian, and Sasanian empires.
Right.
We need to examine its unique 52-letter alphabet, its early Christian church, and significantly, how the legacy of this ancient kingdom is fiercely contested in modern geopolitical disputes.
Before we can even get to the people, the alphabet, or the empires, we have to talk about the name. Because there is a massive geographic misconception here that trips up almost everyone.
The modern country.
Yes, exactly. When someone hears the word Albania, their mind immediately goes to the modern Balkan nation of Albania, located north of Greece, across the Adriatic from Italy. We need to be explicitly clear right at the start. Caucasian Albania has absolutely zero historical, genetic, or linguistic connection to the modern Balkan nation.
None whatsoever. They are entirely unrelated entities separated by thousands of miles and completely different ethno-linguistic origins.
So it's just a coincidence?
Purely a matter of linguistic coincidence, specifically stemming from how external empires, namely the Greeks and the Romans, applied names to the edges of their known world.
Let's break that down because it is notable how a name gets applied to a place. If they have nothing to do with each other, how did they end up with the exact same name on the historical map?
Well, it comes down to the etymology used by Greek and Roman geographers. Figures like Strabo in the 1st century BCE or Pliny the Elder in the 1st century frequently utilize the prefix Alp.
Okay, Alp.
This root roughly translates to mountainous or white. They used it as a highly descriptive geographic utility word. You see this root applied all across the ancient world to describe snowy or high-altitude terrain.
So it is a topographical descriptor, not an ethnic one. It is like calling a poet the highlands or the snowy peaks.
Precisely. It is the same linguistic root we find in the Alps mountains in Europe.
Yeah.
It is in Alba Longa, the ancient city in the Alban hills of Italy.
Oh, right.
It is even the root of Albion, the oldest known name for the island of Great Britain, referring to the white chalk cliffs of Dover.
That makes a lot of sense.
So when Roman mapmakers looked at the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus, they applied that same familiar Alb prefix. They were labeling the terrain, not the specific cultural identity of the people living there.
I look at this and I think of convergent evolution in biology. That is when two completely unrelated species develop the exact same physical trait independently just because they live in similar environments.
That's a good way to look at it.
Like how sharks and dolphins both have dorsal fins, but they aren't related. In this case, two completely unrelated groups of people in the Balkans and the Caucasus were given the exact same name by external empires purely because they both lived in mountainous, snowy environments.
That is a very effective way to conceptualize it. Ancient empires frequently prioritize their own administrative or geographic naming conventions over the indigenous names used by the local populations. The term Caucasian Albania is what we call an exonym.
A name applied by outsiders.
Exactly. The people living between the Caucasus Mountains and the Caspian Sea did not walk around calling themselves Albanians.
Which raises the obvious question, what did they call themselves? If I were to travel back to the 1st century and ask a local merchant what country we were in, what would he say?
That is where the historical record becomes remarkably silent. We do not possess the indigenous endonym, the name the people used for themselves, in any surviving texts from that specific era.
We don't have it all.
We don't. What we do have are the names used by their immediate neighbors. The neighboring Armenians referred to the region as Agwank or Aluwank.
Okay.
The Parthians, the major Persian empire to the south, called it Artan. Later on, when the Arab conquests reached the region in the 7th century, Islamic sources referred to the territory as Alran or Aran.
So everyone had a different name for them, and we don't know what they called themselves. It makes you wonder if they even had a single unified name for their own kingdom. And looking at the geography, you can start to see why unity might have been difficult. Let's map out the physical space we were talking about.
The geography is critical to understanding their entire history. The borders of this ancient kingdom were defined by formidable natural barriers.
Right.
To the north, you have the Greater Caucasus Mountains, which act as a massive, towering wall separating the region from the Eurasian steppe. To the east is the vast expanse of the Caspian Sea.
Okay, so mountains and sea.
To the south, the border was generally defined by the Araxes River, and to the west, the boundary was the Kura River, which also features the highly strategic Darban Pass.
We need to pause on the Kura River and the Darban Pass because that topography dictates everything that happens later. You have this massive mountain range, and then you have a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea. It is a choke point.
It is one of the most vital strategic choke points in the ancient world. The Darban Pass is a narrow coastal strip along the western shore of the Caspian Sea. Because the Greater Caucasus Mountains are largely impassable for large armies or nomadic migrations, anyone wanting to move north or south between the Eurasian steppes and the wealthy empires of the Middle East had to funnel through this specific pass.
It is the front door to the empires of the south. If you control that pass, you control the flow of trade, and more importantly, you control the flow of invading armies.
Yes.
Which explains why this specific territory was so highly coveted. But let's look at the people actually living behind these natural walls. Because the lack of a single endonym, the fact that we don't know what they called themselves, hints at a deeply fragmented society.
It does. The Greek geographer Strabo provides us with one of the most detailed, albeit external, accounts from the early 1st century. When documenting the lands north of the Kura River, Strabo noted that the kingdom was composed of 26 distinct tribes.
26 distinct tribes packed into this one geographic area between the mountains and the sea. That is an immense density of different groups.
And Strabo's account goes further. He noted that each of these 26 tribes originally had its own ruler, and crucially, each spoke a language or dialect so distinct that mutual intelligibility was rare.
Wait, they couldn't understand each other.
No, they required interpreters just to conduct basic trade or negotiations with one another. Sometime before the 1st century BCE, these disparate groups federated into a single state ruled by one king, but that intense linguistic and tribal diversity remained a defining characteristic of the region.
I want to really sit with that for a second because 26 mutually unintelligible languages within one relatively small kingdom is a logistical nightmare. Just think about trying to run a state.
It's very complicated.
Right, like how do you collect taxes? How do you issue laws? If the king calls for an army to assemble, how do the generals even issue orders on the battlefield if the soldiers from the northern mountains cannot understand the soldiers from the river valleys?
It requires an extensive reliance on bilingual or multilingual intermediaries. Statecraft in such an environment is incredibly complex. The central authority, the king, would likely have to rely on a dominant trade language, or perhaps the language of the most militarily powerful tribe within the Confederation, to serve as a baseline for administration.
Do we know which tribes those might be?
Well, the sources do mention specific names for some of the more prominent tribes. The Ushans, the Gargars, the Mascots, the Gels, the Legs. It is highly probable that the language of one of these larger groups, like the Gargars or Ushans, functioned as a lingua franca for the political elite.
Okay, let's talk about the languages themselves. If they aren't speaking a variation of Greek or Persian, what exactly were they speaking? What language family does this belong to?
Linguistic analysis of the surviving evidence confirms that the primary language of Caucasian Albania belongs to the Northeast Caucasian language family, specifically a branch known as the Lesgic subgroup.
The Lesgic subgroup.
Yes, this is sometimes referred to as the Nakdagestanian family. It is deeply indigenous to the Caucasus region and has absolutely no genetic relationship to Indo-European languages like Latin, Greek, or Persian, nor is it related to Turkic or Semitic languages.
I know the languages of the Caucasus are famous among linguists for being incredibly complicated. I've read they have sounds that don't exist almost anywhere else.
They are renowned for their complexity. The Northeast Caucasian languages are characterized by extensive consonant inventories. While English has 24 consonant sounds, some of these languages possess upwards of 60 or 70 distinct consonants.
60 or 70?
Yes, including ejectives and pharyngeal sounds produced deep in the throat. Furthermore, they utilize highly complex grammar systems, most notably ergative alignment.
Hold on, ergative alignment. My brain just short-circuited. Break that down for me like I have zero background in linguistics. What does that actually mean for how a person constructs a sentence?
Well, it is a fundamental difference in how a language treats the subject of a sentence. In English, which has a nominative-accusative alignment, the subject of a sentence is treated the same way whether the verb involves an action affecting something else or not.
Okay, give me an example.
For example, if I say the king sleeps, the king is the subject. If I say the king builds a wall, the king is still the subject and is grammatically treated exactly the same. The focus remains on the king.
Right, the king is always the one doing the thing, whether he's just sleeping or actively building. That makes intuitive sense to an English speaker.
But in a language with ergative alignment, like ancient Caucasian Albanian, the grammar shifts based on the action. The subject of an intransitive verb, like sleeps, is treated grammatically the same as the object of a transitive verb.
Okay, wait, walk me through that with the king and the wall.
If you say the king sleeps, the word king takes a specific grammatical form, usually the absolutive case. But if you say the king builds a wall, the word wall takes that same absolutive form, while the word king takes a special form called the ergative case, marking him specifically as the agent of an action that affects something else.
Ah, I see.
Philosophically, it places a heavy grammatical emphasis on the object being affected by an action, rather than just the person doing it.
That is a completely different way of mapping reality through language.
Yeah.
It highlights how isolated and distinct this culture was from the empire surrounding it. And the most compelling detail in the sources is that this linguistic lineage didn't entirely vanish when the kingdom fell. There is a living thread today.
There is a vital modern survival. We can look to the Udi people. Today, they are a small community numbering roughly 4,000 to 10,000 individuals.
That's quite small.
It is. They primarily live in the villages of Nij and Oguz in modern Azerbaijan, with some populations in parts of neighboring Georgia. Their language, the severely endangered Udi language, is considered by linguists to be the direct descendant of the ancient Caucasian Albanian language.
That is a survival story spanning over 2 millennia. How can linguists be certain that a language spoken in a couple villages today is the direct descendant of a kingdom that disappeared in the 9th century?
The connection is supported by rigorous comparative linguistics. When scholars analyze the basic vocabulary, words for water, stone, family members, body parts, they estimate that modern Udi shares 60 to 70% of its core lexical root words with the ancient language found in historical texts.
60 to 70% is a massive retention rate over that time span.
It is. Of course, modern Udi has evolved. It has undergone phonetic shifts, such as the loss of certain complex palatalized consonants over the centuries, likely due to contact with other regional languages.
Sure, languages change.
Exactly. However, it preserves those core, deeply embedded grammatical structures, like the ergative alignment we just discussed, that directly link it to the antiquity of the region.
Here's where the story pivots from interesting linguistics into a full-blown historical thriller. Because for a very long time, historians only had a few references to what this ancient language looked like. We knew they had a written script, but the physical evidence was missing. We have to talk about how this alphabet was created and how it was eventually rediscovered.
The creation of the script is a momentous event in their history. According to historical tradition, around the early 5th century, specifically between the years 408 and 421, a script was specifically engineered for the Caucasian Albanian language. The man credited with this is the Armenian monk and scholar Mesrob Mashtots.
Creating an alphabet from scratch is a huge intellectual achievement, and this wasn't his only one, right?
Mashtots is a pivotal intellectual figure of late antiquity in the region. He is traditionally credited with creating three distinct alphabets for the South Caucasus: the Armenian script, the Georgian script, and the Caucasian Albanian script.
Why did they suddenly need an alphabet in the 5th century? They had been a kingdom for hundreds of years at that point.
The catalyst was religion. The kingdom had recently adopted Christianity. When you adopt a text-based religion, you need a way to translate the sacred texts, the Gospels, the liturgy, into a language the local population can understand.
That makes sense.
You cannot rely solely on Greek or Syriac texts if the priests and the congregation speak a Northeast Caucasian language.
So it was an administrative necessity for the church.
Precisely. The Caucasian Albanian script consisted of 52 characters. The sheer number of characters reflects the need to represent that massive, complex consonant inventory we discussed earlier.
Right, the 60 or 70 sounds.
Yes. The script was developed to facilitate biblical translations, but it also served a crucial political function. It helped standardize a literary medium among this incredibly diverse tribal confederation.
Right, if you have 26 tribes, having one official written script is a way to bind them together. But physical evidence of this 52-letter script was virtually non-existent for centuries. Historians essentially knew it existed because a medieval Armenian manuscript contained a list of the alphabet. It was a theoretical ghost until 1975.
The rediscovery is one of the great triumphs of modern manuscript studies. It occurred at St. Catherine's Monastery, located at the foot of Mount Sinai in Egypt. This is one of the oldest continuously functioning Christian monasteries in the world, and it houses a vast ancient library.
And what happened in 1975?
Well, in 1975, a fire at the monastery led the monks to clear out some debris, which resulted in the discovery of a hidden, forgotten cache of ancient documents.
And among these documents, researchers found something called palimpsests. For anyone who isn't a medieval archivist, explain what a palimpsest actually is physically. How was it made?
In antiquity and the Middle Ages, writing material, specifically parchment made from animal skin, was incredibly expensive and labor-intensive to produce. You couldn't simply go buy a ream of paper. If a monastery needed to copy a new text but they lacked fresh parchment, they would recycle older books that they deemed less important or perhaps couldn't read anymore.
Monks literally washing away history to save money on office supplies.
Exactly. The process involved taking an older manuscript, unbinding it, and using a mixture of milk, cheese, or mild acids, along with a pumice stone, to physically wash and scrape the existing ink off the parchment.
That sounds intense.
Once the pages were scraped clean and dried, they would write the new text over the ghost of the old text. The resulting document, with a visible top layer of text and an erased, hidden bottom layer, is a palimpsest.
So researchers looking at this cache in the Sinai Desert find these Georgian manuscripts. They're reading the top layer, but they can see faint, washed-out letters underneath.
Yes, and the critical breakthrough came in the late 20th century through the work of a Georgian scholar named Zaza Alexidze. He was examining these palimpsests and recognized that the lower, washed-away layer of text, the script that had been deemed useless and scrubbed away centuries ago, was actually the lost 52-letter Caucasian Albanian script.
That is a major moment of realization. But if it was washed and scraped off with pumice stones, how could they actually read it?
The physical recovery of the text required advanced technology. Between 2003 and 2010, an international team of scholars and scientists utilized multispectral imaging on the manuscripts.
How does multispectral imaging actually pull invisible ink out of scraped animal skin?
When ancient ink, particularly iron gall ink, is applied to parchment, it doesn't just sit on the surface, it bites into the fibers of the skin. Even when you scrape the surface away, residual chemical traces of the ink remain embedded in the parchment.
Ah, I see.
Multispectral imaging involves taking dozens of high-resolution digital photographs of the page, but each photograph uses a very specific narrow band of light wavelength, ranging from ultraviolet through the visible spectrum and into infrared.
So they are blasting the page with different types of light.
Correct. Because the chemical residue of the old ink reacts differently to specific wavelengths of light than the new ink or the blank parchment, the computers can analyze these photographs and mathematically separate the layers. It essentially allows the computer to subtract the top layer of Georgian text and visually enhance the erased Caucasian Albanian text underneath, making it readable again.
That is basically time travel through chemistry and light.
Yeah.
What did they actually find when they enhanced the text?
They uncovered a treasure trove. They recovered 50 pages of continuous text dating back to the 5th and 6th centuries. The content included substantial portions of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, along with various epistles, including Romans and Corinthians.
This proves that the script wasn't just a theoretical exercise by a monk. It was actively being used for high-level liturgy in the church. But it brings us back to that logistical nightmare. If Strabo said they had 26 languages, how did this one language become the official text? Did they translate the Bible 26 times?
That is highly unlikely. When a script is commissioned for a state, it is almost always based on the dialect of the dominant political or economic group. The prevailing scholarly theory is that the script was based on the dialect of the Gargars or the Ushans. These tribes likely resided near the political and religious centers of the kingdom, such as the early capital of Kabbalah.
So the dominant tribe gets their dialect immortalized in ink.
Exactly. The script served as a unifying tool, a lingua franca for the church and state administration. Even if local dialects persisted in daily oral use among the mountain tribes, the written language of power and salvation was centralized.
But this fractured multi-tribal nature of the region, a confederation of mountain tribes relying on a centralized script to hold them together, didn't just pose a linguistic challenge, it created a massive geopolitical vulnerability.
It absolutely did.
If you are a fractured society sitting on one of the most vital trade and military routes in the world, the Darben Pass, you are exactly the kind of target ancient superpowers look for. This takes us directly into the geopolitical chessboard of the classical era, specifically the centuries-long conflict between Rome and Parthia.
Caucasian Albania enters the broader international relations system in a highly significant way following the collapse of Alexander the Great's empire and the subsequent fading of the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire. By the 1st century BCE, the power vacuum in West Asia had been filled by two dominant titans: the Roman Republic, which was rapidly transitioning into the Roman Empire, and the Parthian Empire, a formidable Iranian power to the south.
It is the classic unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, and Caucasian Albania is the grass getting trampled underneath them. Both Rome and Parthia wanted the South Caucasus.
They both recognized its supreme strategic value. It was a vital buffer zone. It possessed fertile agricultural lands in the river valleys, but more importantly, it controlled the geography.
The pass.
Yes, if you control the Darband Pass, you dictate who can move between the northern steppes and the southern empires. For Parthia, controlling Albania meant securing their northern flank against nomadic raids. For Rome, controlling Albania meant outflanking Parthia and projecting power all the way to the Caspian Sea.
Rome's first major direct involvement in the region is a name everyone recognizes: Pompey the Great.
Yes, during Pompey's Eastern campaign. In 65 BCE, Pompey advanced his legions deep into the Caucasus. His primary objective was to secure the eastern frontiers and eliminate the threat of King Mithridates of Pontus. After systematically subduing neighboring Armenia and the Kingdom of Iberia, which is modern-day eastern Georgia, Pompey marched his forces on Albania.
A Roman legion marching into the foothills of the Caucasus. How did the Albanians respond?
They resisted, but the Roman military machine was at its peak. Pompey engaged and defeated the Albanian king Oroesses. Following the battle, the Romans extracted tribute and secured a nominal allegiance from the Albanian state.
But the Romans were stretched thin. Projecting power from Rome all the way to the Caspian Sea is a logistical nightmare even today, let alone 2,000 years ago. Roman control in the East was always fluctuating based on supply lines and politics back in the Senate.
It was highly volatile. Just 12 years later, in 53 BCE, the Romans suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in their history at the Battle of Carrhae, where the Parthians decimated the legions of Crassus.
Right, that was a disaster for Rome.
And the historical sources note a fascinating detail about that battle. Albanian and Iberian troops actually fought alongside the Parthian cavalry against the Romans.
Wait, so 12 years after Pompey conquers them and forces them into an alliance, the Albanians are on the battlefield helping the Parthians slaughter Romans.
It perfectly demonstrates the shifting allegiances required of a bucker state. They bent the knee to Pompey when the legions were on their doorstep, but when the Roman presence receded and the Parthians exerted pressure, they realigned.
That makes sense for survival.
However, Rome always returned. In 36 BCE, Mark Antony launched his own massive campaign against Parthia. Anticipating the need for a secure northern flank, he dispatched his general, Canisius Crassus, to march back into the Caucasus.
Mark Antony doesn't want the Albanians attacking his supply lines while he's fighting Parthia.
Exactly. Canisius moved swiftly. He defeated the Iberian king and then turned his attention to the Albanian king, Zober. Zober was defeated and forced into a formal alliance with Rome, effectively neutralizing the Caucasus while Antony focused south.
We talk about these treaties and alliances, but there is actual physical evidence of Rome's reach into this specific territory that is quite substantial. It isn't just words on a manuscript. In 1948, archaeologists made a discovery in the Gubustan region, which is right near the coast of the Caspian Sea in modern Azerbaijan.
It is a remarkable piece of epigraphic evidence. They discovered a rock carving bearing a Latin inscription. It was left by a centurion of the 12th Legion Fulminata.
The 12th Legion, the Thunderbolt Legion.
Yes. Based on the naming conventions in the inscription, it dates precisely to the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian between the years 81 and 96.
I want to picture the reality of this. A Roman centurion, a guy from Italy, or maybe a veteran from Syria, is standing on the rocky shores of the Caspian Sea, looking out over the water, and he chisels his unit's name into a boulder. What is a Roman military detachment doing that far east?
The presence of the 12th Legion on the Caspian shores is highly significant. It indicates that Roman influence was not merely abstract diplomacy. It involved active military reconnaissance, securing supply routes, or perhaps providing direct military support and bodyguards for client kings in the Albanian territory. It shows the sheer scale of Roman logistical reach when they deemed an area strategically vital.
This back and forth, fighting Pompey, allying with Parthia, getting conquered by Antony, hosting Roman centurions. Let's ground this in international relations theory. The sources apply Kenneth Waltz's concept of the balance of power to explain this behavior. How does that theory actually map onto the decisions of an ancient Albanian king?
Well, Waltz's theory posits that in an anarchic international system where there is no global police force, smaller states must make calculated alliance choices to ensure their own survival against larger threats. They typically have two choices: bandwagoning, which means allying with the primary threat in hopes of appeasing it, or balancing, which means allying with a secondary power to counter the primary threat.
Okay, let's look at the Albanian kings through that lens. They frequently chose to align with the distant Roman Empire rather than the neighboring Parthian Empire. Why? Parthia is right next door. Wouldn't it be easier to just appease them?
The geopolitical logic is actually quite sound when you consider the threat of assimilation. Parthia was geographically adjacent. If the Albanian state fully aligned with Parthia or bandwagoned, there was a remarkably high risk of being culturally, administratively, and militarily swallowed whole.
They would just take over.
Yes, the Parthians could easily march an army across the Araxes River and replace the king with a Persian governor.
The threat of total annexation is constant.
But Rome was a distant hegemon. Allying with Rome provided a crucial security guarantee against Parthian aggression. The Parthians would hesitate to attack a formal Roman ally. Crucially, however, Rome lacked the logistical capacity to permanently occupy and micromanage the Caucasus.
They couldn't stay.
Exactly. The Roman legions would arrive, secure the treaty, take their tribute, and then they had to march back west to deal with the Germanic tribes or rebellions in Gaul. We see this limitation clearly when the Emperor Nero had to completely cancel a planned military expedition to the Caspian Sea because he needed those troops to suppress internal revolts in Europe.
So allying with Rome was a highly calculated way to stay safe from Parthia without losing your own autonomy to Rome.
It was. It allowed the local dynasties to maintain their own internal rule while the empires exhausted each other.
It made you reevaluate how we view these smaller states. Sometimes you read history and a small kingdom seems unreliable, constantly breaking treaties and switching sides. But it isn't unreliability. It is a highly sophisticated survival strategy for a state wedged between titans. It is an intricate dance.
And we see this diplomatic dance continue for centuries. During the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, around the years 117 to 138, the historical records show nomadic Alan incursions threatening the region.
What did the local rulers do?
The Albanian and Iberian rulers carefully navigated Roman diplomatic requests. They would accept generous financial gifts and military subsidies from Hadrian to fortify the passes, but they cautiously refused invitations to personally appear before him in Rome.
They take the gold but refuse to kiss the ring in person, maintaining their physical distance and sovereignty.
It was a masterful display of managing a superpower. However, this delicate balancing act between Rome and Parthia fundamentally changed in the 3rd century. The geopolitical board was flipped.
What happened?
The Parthian state, weakened by centuries of war and internal dynastic struggles, collapsed. In the year 224, A new, far more centralized and aggressive Persian dynasty rose to power, the Sasanian Empire.
This transition from Parthia to the Sasanians is a massive pivot point. It forces Albania into a much tighter, more restrictive, and oppressive imperial framework. The era of playing empires off each other comes to an end.
The Sasanian era marks a dramatic shift in the nature of regional control. The Sasanians were not content with nominal tribute, they demanded direct integration. In the year 252, the second Sasanian king, Shapur I, decisively annexed Caucasian Albania, transforming it from a semi-independent ally into a tightly controlled vassal state.
We actually see this annexation recorded in stone. Albania appears explicitly in Shapur's famous inscription at the Kaaba-e-Zartosh in Iran, listed as one of the formal provinces of his empire.
Under the Sasanians, the nature of vassalage was intense. Local dynasties were still permitted to rule, as it was easier to govern through established local elites than to import Persian administrators.
Who were these local rulers?
Initially, the rulers were the Arsacids, who were actually a branch of the old defeated Parthian royal family that had fled north. Later, in the 7th century, power shifted to the Muranids, another family with deep Iranian roots, which produced notable historical figures like Prince Javanshir.
So they let local kings sit on the throne, but I imagine there was someone standing right behind that throne taking notes.
Absolutely. These local rulers were heavily monitored by Sasanian military governors, known in Persian as Marzbans. The Marzban was the true wielder of military authority, ensuring the local king did not harbor rebellions or conspire with Rome, which had now transitioned into the Byzantine Empire.
And the Sasanians completely reorganized the map. The Sasanian kings, particularly Khosrow I in the 6th century, initiated massive administrative reforms. They integrated Albania and neighboring territories into a massive northern military zone, administratively known as the Azerbaijani Kast.
The primary driver behind this intense centralization and militarization was not just controlling the local population, it was the northern threat. The Caucasus Mountains functioned as the critical barrier between the settled agricultural empires of the south, with their cities and trade routes, and the nomadic warrior confederations of the Eurasian steppe.
The steppe nomads. This is the era of massive migrations.
The Sasanians were under constant existential threat from incursions by groups like the Huns, the Sabirs, and later the powerful Khazar Khaganate. If these nomadic cavalry forces breached the mountains, they could devastate the heartland of the Sasanian Empire in a matter of weeks.
The Sasanians needed Caucasian Albania to stop being a trade hub and start being a fortress.
They militarized the entire society. The Sasanians heavily utilized Albanian military forces. Historical records document Albanian cavalry and foot soldiers fighting as auxiliaries in Sasanian armies against the Romans in the west.
But their main job was the north.
Yes, their primary function was holding the line in the north. The Sasanians invested massive resources into heavily fortifying the Darban Pass, constructing a monumental defensive wall system designed to seal the choke point completely.
I look at this era, with the Marzbans watching the kings and the massive walls being built, and I think of the concept of a garrison state. Instead of being an independent kingdom engaging in agile diplomacy, Albania became the ancient equivalent of a heavily fortified border wall for the Sasanians. They became the physical shield of the Persian Empire.
It is an accurate assessment of their geopolitical utility to the Sasanians. But the Sasanians did not just exert control through military fortifications, they applied profound cultural and linguistic pressure.
How does an empire force a culture to change without just killing everyone?
Through the mechanisms of administration and elite status. The Sasanian administration operated entirely in Middle Persian. If a member of the Albanian nobility wanted to maintain their status, interact with the Marsmen, or secure a military command, they had to adopt Iranian administrative practices.
So they had to blend in.
They had to adopt Persian naming conventions, known as onomastics, and they had to incorporate Persian vocabulary into their daily operations.
It is an adapt or perish scenario for the elites.
And we see the results of this pressure in the linguistic record today. When linguists analyze the surviving Caucasian Albanian texts, they find a massive layer of Parthian and Middle Persian loanwords embedded in the language. These aren't words for farming or family. They are specifically words relating to statecraft, law, and military organization, reflecting the domains where the Persians exerted absolute dominance.
So the Sasanians are completely dominating the state. They control the military, they control the administration, they are changing the vocabulary. But while they are succeeding militarily and culturally, they face a massive immovable ideological roadblock.
Religion.
Yes, because the Sasanians were staunch, state-sponsored Zoroastrians, but the Albanian people were undergoing a profound spiritual awakening in a completely different direction. This brings us to the intersection of the cross and the fire, the complex religious history of Albania.
To understand the magnitude of this religious shift, we must first establish the baseline. Before the arrival of Christianity, the region possessed deep, entrenched pagan roots. Strabo documented the early Albanian polytheism. He noted that they worshipped gods of the sun and the sky, but they held the moon deity in the absolute highest regard.
And this wasn't just a peaceful agricultural moon cult.
No, it involved severe rituals. There is compelling archaeological evidence to corroborate the ancient textual accounts that they practiced human sacrifice as a central component of these lunar rituals.
That's intense.
For instance, archaeologists excavating at Mingachevir discovered a skeleton bound in heavy fetters, which aligns with descriptions of sacrificial victims being prepared for the altar.
So you have a deeply entrenched polytheistic society with intense rituals. But the paradigm shifts dramatically in the early 4th century. The historical tradition states that around the year 313, the Albanian king Ernair formally adopted Christianity.
According to the chronicles, King Ernair traveled to neighboring Armenia and was baptized by Gregory the Illuminator, the exact same cleric who had successfully evangelized the Armenian royal court just a few years prior.
Which is notable timing. This makes Caucasian Albania one of the earliest states in the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion, doing so right around the exact same time as Armenia, and concurrently with the Roman Empire's shift under Emperor Constantine.
It was a civilizational pivot. However, this new religious alignment directly clashed with their military and political subordination to the Sasanian Empire. The Sasanians viewed Christianity with deep existential suspicion.
Because of Rome.
Right. Because the rival Roman and later Byzantine Empire had adopted Christianity, the Sasanians frequently equated the Christian faith with political loyalty to the enemy. To be a Christian in the Sasanian realm was often viewed as being a potential fifth column.
The tension is inevitable. You have a vassal state commanded to protect the northern border, but they share the religion of the empire's greatest enemy to the west. This tension explodes in the 5th century under a specific Sasanian king.
King Yazdegerd II, who ruled the Sasanian Empire from 439 to 457. Yazdegerd implemented a policy of aggressive, forced religious homogenization. He attempted to impose Zoroastrianism across the entire Caucasus region to ensure total political loyalty.
How do you force a religion on a mountainous region?
He dispatched hundreds of Zoroastrian magi, priests, backed by military force, with orders to convert the population, extinguish the church altars, and establish the sacred Zoroastrian fires.
The Albanians do not take this quietly.
The aggressive policy sparked massive coordinated regional rebellions. The Albanians united with the Armenians to resist the Sasanian forces. This culminated in the famous Battle of Avarir in the year 451. The combined Caucasian Christian forces fought a massive Sasanian army equipped with war elephants.
Who won?
Militarily, it was a defeat for the Christian forces. The Armenian commander, Vardan Mamikonian, was killed. However, the sheer ferocity of the resistance and the protracted guerrilla warfare that followed in the mountains eventually forced the Sasanians to calculate that the cost of forced conversion was too high.
So they stopped.
They backed down and granted religious tolerance to the region. Following this concession, the Albanian king Vash II publicly reaffirmed the Christian faith of his state.
We need to look closely at the Church of Caucasian Albania itself, because it wasn't just a generic Christian outpost. It was an autocephalous Oriental Orthodox church. Let's provide an explanation for autocephalous. What does that mean for the daily operations of a church?
Well, autocephalous translates literally to self-headed. In the hierarchy of the early Christian church, it meant that the Albanian church possessed the authority to appoint its own highest leader, known as a Catholicos.
So they are independent.
They governed themselves independently. They did not have to answer to or take orders from a higher patriarch in Rome, Constantinople, or even neighboring Armenia. They were structurally autonomous.
A self-governing church. And that independence becomes crucial during one of the biggest theological crises in Christian history, which also happens in that exact same year, 451.
Yes, the Council of Chalcedon. This was a monumental gathering of church leaders that resulted in a permanent schism within global Christianity. The debate centered on a highly complex theological question regarding the nature of Christ. The Byzantine, or Eastern Roman Church, adopted a position known as diophysitism.
Which means what in plain terms?
Diophysitism is the belief that Christ possessed two distinct, unconfused natures, one fully human and one fully divine, coexisting within one person. This became the standard Orthodox position of the Byzantine Empire.
But the Albanian Church, acting alongside the Armenian Church, looked at that Byzantine decree and rejected it.
They entirely rejected the Chalcedonian Creed. Instead, they adopted and maintained a theological position known as monophysitism, or more accurately in their context, miaphysitism. This is the belief that the divine and human natures of Christ were united into a single, inseparable, composite nature.
I try to put myself in the shoes of a local farmer or a merchant in Albania in the 5th century. Are they really willing to alienate the massive Byzantine Empire over the nuanced philosophical difference between two natures and one united nature?
For the theologians, the distinction was paramount. But for the state, this theological stance was heavily intertwined with ecclesiastical politics and sheer state survival. By rigidly maintaining monophysitism, Albania and Armenia effectively created a distinct, unified cultural and religious bloc in the Caucasus.
It was a geopolitical shield.
Exactly, it served a dual purpose. On one side, their Christianity allowed them to resist assimilation into Sasanian Zoroastrianism. On the other side, their specific brand of non-Chalcedonian Christianity prevented them from being absorbed into the ecclesiastical and political hierarchy of the Byzantine Orthodox Empire.
That makes a lot of sense.
Religion functioned as a proxy for maintaining geopolitical independence from both superpowers.
That is brilliant maneuvering. But it brings up a question about their relationship with Armenia. If the Albanian Church shared the exact same Miaphysite theology as the Armenians, and they received their initial evangelization from Gregory the Illuminator of Armenia, did the Albanian Church actually possess a distinct identity? Or were they just essentially a branch office of the Armenian Church?
They were fiercely independent for centuries. The Albanian Church maintained its own unique liturgy conducted in the Caucasian Albanian language, utilizing the script we discussed earlier. They possessed their own distinct ecclesiastical hierarchy.
So they weren't taking orders from Armenia at this point?
No, they convened their own independent theological synods, most notably the crucial Council of Aguin in the year 488, which codified the specific laws and canons of the Albanian Church. The elevated status of their Catholicos allowed him to operate freely and authoritatively within the political framework of the Albanian state.
This shared religious fabric with Armenia, however, would ultimately be one of the very few things to survive the cataclysmic shifts that arrived in the 7th and 8th centuries. We are moving from the intense spiritual and political life of the kingdom to its economic peak, and eventually to its ultimate catastrophic collapse.
It is important to note that prior to its fall, Caucasian Albania enjoyed periods of significant economic prosperity. The geography that made it a military choke point also made it an economic powerhouse. Strabo noted the immense fertility of the land, stating it was capable of producing 2 abundant harvests a year without intense labor.
Wow, that's incredibly fertile.
Pliny the Elder wrote of valuable salt rivers in the region.
And it was deeply integrated into global trade. The region was a vital node on the Great Silk Road.
The urban centers reflect this wealth. Cities like Kabala, which served as the early capital, and later Parta, known today as modern Barda, evolved into massive commercial hubs. They facilitated the movement of high-value goods, silk, spices, salt, manufactured crafts between the empires of China, the Middle East, and Europe.
This is the wealth that funded the construction of the monasteries, the translation of the palimpsests, and the maintenance of the large armies required by the Sasanians. But the geopolitical landscape of the mid-7th century brought an unprecedented, overwhelming force that neither the Sasanians nor the Byzantines were prepared for.
The rise of early Islam. In the mid-7th century, Arab forces, expanding rapidly under the banner of the new Islamic Caliphate, moved decisively into the Caucasus. The geopolitical shockwave was absolute. The Sasanian Empire, exhausted by decades of war, was completely destroyed and absorbed by the Caliphate.
Just gone.
Yes, and the Byzantine Empire was severely crippled and pushed out of the region entirely.
The two titans that Albania had balanced between for centuries were suddenly gone, replaced by a single massive new hegemon. How did the Albanian leadership react? Did they try to fight?
Initially, local rulers attempted to employ the same survival strategies they had used for centuries. The most famous example is the Maronid prince Javanshir. He tried to maneuver diplomatically, formally submitting to the caliphate and paying tribute, while desperately trying to retain local autonomy in his Christian faith, much like his ancestors did with Rome and Parthia.
But the caliphate was operating on a different administrative model. They didn't just want a buffer state, they integrated the territory.
The religious and political independence of the Albanian state was systematically dismantled over the next century. A critical blow occurred in the year 705.
What happened then?
Under intense pressure and manipulation from the Arab administration, which favored dealing with a single Christian authority in the region rather than multiple competing ones, the Albanian church lost its autocephalous status.
They lost their independence.
By caliphal decree, the Albanian church was officially subordinated to the Armenian Apostolic Church. The position of the Albanian Catholicos was downgraded, and the church lost its institutional autonomy.
And the political state could not hold on much longer. The defining moment of final collapse comes in the 9th century. The last Albanian king of the Muranid dynasty was assassinated in the year 822. That assassination marks the formal, definitive end of Caucasian Albania as a political entity. The lines on the map are officially erased.
But the loss of statehood is only the beginning of the story of dissolution. The fragmentation of the population following the fall of the state was profound. The cohesive society of 26 tribes essentially dissolved over the subsequent centuries, following 3 distinct paths of assimilation.
Let's trace those paths. What happened to the people in the river valleys and the cities?
A massive portion of the population, particularly in the accessible lowlands and urban centers, gradually converted to Islam. As they integrated into the Islamic sphere, they adopted Persian cultural norms and later the Turkic linguistic elements brought by subsequent migrations.
Okay, so that's the first group.
Right. This Islamized, Turkic-speaking group directly and significantly contributed to the ethnogenesis of the modern Azerbaijani people.
But what about the people in the mountains who refused to convert? The Christians.
Those who remained steadfastly Christian retreated to the mountainous, defensible regions, particularly in areas like Artsakh, known today as modern Nagorno-Karabakh, and the province of Utik. However, because their church had been legally subordinated to the Armenian hierarchy back in 705, their religious life fundamentally changed.
The liturgy shifted.
Exactly. The Caucasian Albanian language was phased out of the church services, replaced by Armenian. Over several generations, bound by a shared faith, shared persecution, and a shared ecclesiastical structure, these Albanian mountain tribes heavily assimilated into Armenian culture and identity.
And what about the third path?
Meanwhile, a smaller subset of the population located in the western border zones was gradually Georgianized, adopting Georgian language and Orthodox Christianity.
It is a total, comprehensive civilizational reboot. The shift to Islamic rule replaced the Caucasian Albanian language and script in the public sphere. Arabic became the mandatory language of religion and state administration, while Persian and eventually Turkic became the dominant languages of culture, poetry, and commerce.
The script just faded away.
Yeah, the 52-letter Albanian script simply lost its function. It was abandoned, forgotten, and eventually washed off parchment by monks who needed the space for Georgian texts.
It's a striking historical shift.
I try to visualize the fall of Caucasian Albania, and I think of it like a massive melting glacier. The glacier doesn't just vanish into thin air in an instant. It fractures, it melts over time, and its waters flow outward, dividing into 3 different rivers. The waters of Caucasian Albania flowed into and contributed to the Azerbaijani, Armenian, and Georgian cultures that exist today.
That is a highly evocative and accurate demographic analogy. The genetic, cultural, and historical legacy of the Albanian tribes was distributed among the successor populations of the entire South Caucasus. The only exception to this total assimilation is that small Udi community we discussed earlier, who managed to maintain a distinct, unbroken linguistic continuity to the ancient Northeast Caucasian root.
And because the population fractured and flowed into these different modern groups, the legacy of Caucasian Albania did not die peacefully in 822. It didn't become a dusty piece of ancient trivia. Instead, it is transformed into a highly charged, modern ideological battlefield. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most complex section of our deep dive.
Before we unpack this modern historiographical conflict, it is crucial that we establish the framework for this discussion.
Right. And to our listeners, we must explicitly state that we are impartially reporting the claims of the source material without endorsing either political side. We're just exploring how the history is viewed.
Yes. The geopolitical situation in the South Caucasus today is incredibly tense and frequently tragic. As we examine how these modern nations view the history of Caucasian Albania, we are examining an ongoing debate. We will outline the perspectives maintained by Azerbaijani historians, the perspectives maintained by Armenian historians, and the consensus of independent international scholars.
It is notable to observe how differently modern nations can view the exact same historical data, because both sides look at the ruins of Caucasian Albania and see the foundation of their own modern identity. Let's start by looking at the prevailing perspective within Azerbaijan. Following their independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, scholarship in Azerbaijan has placed a massive emphasis on a continuous cultural and territorial inheritance from Caucasian Albania.
Within the framework of modern Azerbaijani historiography, the ancient kingdom is viewed as a primary foundational root of modern Azerbaijani national identity and territorial legitimacy.
How do they reconcile the ancient Christian kingdom with the modern Islamic Turkic-speaking nation?
Azerbaijani scholars assert that despite the historical shift to Islam and the adoption of Turkic languages, the indigenous Albanian population never left the territory. They simply evolved. Furthermore, a central pillar of their historical argument involves the region's architecture. They argue that many of the ancient Christian monuments, monasteries, and churches located within the territory are originally Caucasian Albanian structures, not Armenian.
But many of those churches have Armenian inscriptions carved right into the stone. How does the scholarship address that?
The narrative frequently characterizes those Armenian inscriptions as later, medieval additions, or in some claims, modern alterations, designed to Armenianize indigenous Albanian heritage.
Conversely, the Armenian historical perspective challenges that narrative completely. They look at the exact same timeline and arrive at a vastly different conclusion about the fate of the Albanian people.
Armenian historiography heavily emphasizes the process of assimilation we discussed earlier. They point out that the Albanian tribes, particularly those residing in the mountainous border regions like Artsakh, had heavily assimilated into Armenian culture as early as the 5th century, bound by a shared religion and, after 705, a shared ecclesiastical hierarchy.
So by the time the medieval era rolls around, the Armenian perspective is that the Albanians in those regions were, for all cultural and religious purposes, Armenian.
Exactly. Consequently, Armenian scholars argue that the inscriptions on the disputed medieval churches, which generally date to the 10th through 13th centuries, are definitively and authentically Armenian in language, theological content, and architectural style.
So they see the ethnicity is gone by then.
Right. They assert that the original Caucasian Albanian ethnicity had effectively dissolved as a distinct cultural force long before these specific medieval monuments were even constructed.
We have two completely incompatible narratives operating over the same physical territory. The sources provide insight into how independent international scholars view this dispute. Scholars like Jos Gippert, who was one of the lead researchers instrumental in utilizing the multispectral imaging to decipher the Sinai palimpsest, point out that both regional narratives often heavily politicize archaeology and history to serve modern needs.
The independent scholarly consensus generally seeks to decouple the ancient history from modern nationalist claims. The prevailing independent view concludes that the true, direct linguistic and cultural heirs to ancient Caucasian Albania are the small, surviving population of Udi people.
Because they actually still speak the language.
Correct. Regarding the broader population, the consensus is that the original Albanian ethnicity as a unified national entity dissolved comprehensively due to the multi-directional forces of Islamization, Armenization, and Georgianization.
It fractured.
Yes. It did not leave a single unified national heir that neatly maps onto the borders of any single modern nation-state.
Looking at this debate raises a deeply compelling philosophical question about the nature of history itself. Can a modern nation legitimately claim the exclusive heritage of an ancient kingdom if the defining characteristics of that ancient kingdom, its unique language, its 52-letter script, and its specific religious theology, have entirely disappeared from their current society?
It is a question without a simple answer, but it demonstrates a fundamental reality of how history functions in the present. History is frequently retroactively drafted to legitimize modern territorial, political, and national claims.
We see this acutely in the context of the South Caucasus, particularly surrounding the tragic and ongoing Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The classification of archaeological evidence becomes a weapon. Consider the massive, intricately carved crossstones found throughout the region, known in Armenian as Khachkars and in Azerbaijani as Katsdash.
The stones themselves become contested.
Right. The debate over whether a specific stone was carved by an assimilated Albanian or an Armenian isn't an academic debate about the 11th century. It is a debate about who owns the land today. The past is not dead. It is actively deployed to secure the present.
It absolutely is.
Okay, let's bring this immense journey all together. We have traversed the entire lifespan of a truly complex state. Caucasian Albania was a kingdom forged from 26 distinct mountain tribes, utilizing interpreters just to speak to one another. Against all odds, they developed a unique 52-letter alphabet to codify their language, and they established a fiercely independent autocephalous Christian church that defended its unique theology against the pressures of both the Byzantine and Persian empires.
It served as a crucial, agile buffer state, skillfully playing Rome against Parthia for centuries. Later, it was transformed into the Sasanian Empire's heavily fortified northern shield against the steppe nomads, before finally fracturing under the overwhelming force of the Arab conquest and dissolving entirely into the diverse, complex ethnic tapestry of the modern South Caucasus.
Looking at the entire sweep of this history leaves you with a profound thought about the sheer fragility of memory. Think back to those Sinai palimpsests we discussed. Think of the physical act of a monk taking a piece of pumice stone and literally scrubbing away the Caucasian Albanian language, the words, the grammar, the nuanced thoughts of an entire civilization, just so they could save money and write over it in Georgian. The physical erasure of history to make room for something new.
It's a very sobering image.
It really is. It forces you to ponder our own time. What modern histories, what indigenous cultures, or what endangered languages are currently being washed away and overwritten by the cultural and political superpowers of today. What invisible ink is being buried right now, just waiting to be rediscovered by future historians armed with new light.
It is a stark reminder that the definitive lines we draw on maps and the cultures we assume are permanent are always vulnerable to the pumice stone of time.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.